The coffee had gone cold somewhere around Fresno, but I kept it wedged in the console anyway. Old habit. My wife Margaret used to say I was the only man alive who could nurse a cold cup of coffee for 200 miles and still pretend it was worth drinking. She wasn't here to say it anymore. She'd been gone 8 years. My name is Richard Hawthorne. I'm 65. I spent 20 years training law enforcement and federal officers in defensive tactics before I retired to grow tomatoes in Sacramento. My life is quiet. I built it that way on purpose. But that Tuesday night, my daughter Emily called me. Her voice was too bright, the kind of bright a room gets when someone turns on every light at once because they don't want you looking too closely at the corners. 11 minutes of conversation. She told me about a coffee shop. She asked about my knee. She never asked about my tomatoes, and Emily always asked about my tomatoes. At the end, there was a half-second pause before she said what she always said, since she was 7 years old and fell off her bike. I'm okay. Daddy, that pause told me more than the 11 minutes had. I lay awake until 2 in the morning, and by 6:15 I was on Interstate 5, driving 6 hours to Beverly Hills on Thanksgiving morning. I thought about the last 8 months, the canceled visits, the calls from bathrooms with her voice pitched low, the missed birthday. I thought about Victor Kensington, her husband. 41, old money, a firm handshake, and the gift of making you feel important. The first time Emily brought him home, he'd helped Margaret clear the table without being asked, and Margaret had whispered that he was lovely. I'd wanted to believe her. But I'd seen something cross his face once, watching Emily refill his water glass before her own, not love. Inventory. The Kensington house was a gated Spanish colonial on North Roxbury Drive. Emily came down the steps to meet me, and when I hugged her, I felt how thin she'd gotten, how fragile her wrists were. She smiled at me, and 20 years of reading people told me the smile was a performance. Not for me, just automatic, the way you perform what's expected once you've done it long enough. Inside, the house smelled like money, and something underneath it I placed after a few minutes. Fear. Victor's mother, Diane, greeted me with the practiced warmth of a woman who'd spent 50 years hosting rooms, then redirected Emily away with an instruction disguised as a favor. I watched my daughter move through that party carefully, refilling wine, adjusting centerpieces, checking Victor's face after every laugh to see if it had been the right kind of laugh. At dinner, Victor held court at the head of the table, while Emily waited to pick up her fork until he'd picked up his. Midway through the meal, she slipped off to the kitchen to quietly swap a dish for a guest with a nut allergy. Small, thoughtful, exactly like her. When she came back, Victor was on his feet. Did I authorize a menu change? The table went silent. Emily explained, steady voice, shaking hands flat on the tablecloth. He kept pressing, voice pleasant, patient in a way that held no patience at all. She said, barely a whisper, I'm your wife, not your employee. He crossed the room and struck her across the face. I was on my feet and between them before I'd decided to move. I told him to step back. He told me this was his house, his wife, and I didn't give orders here. He reached for her again, and I took his wrist. 20 years of training makes certain things simple, not easy. I controlled the joint. He fought it, and in fighting it, he broke 4 of his own fingers against the hold. It took 4 seconds. It felt longer. I got Emily out of that house and drove her straight to Cedars-Sinai. In the emergency room, a woman introduced herself as Carol Bennett, Emily's attorney and friend from law school. Emily had been calling her from borrowed phones for 8 months. Carol handed me a USB drive. 8 months of documented abuse, photographs, recordings, all legally gathered inside Emily's own home. My daughter had been quietly building a case in the dark. The entire time she was telling me she was fine, because she knew if she told me sooner. I'd have done exactly what I'd just done, before she had enough evidence to make it count. That night in the parking garage, I called Mason Cole, a man I'd trained off the streets of Boyle Heights 30 years ago. He didn't ask questions. He said he'd be there in 90 minutes to watch over Emily. Then my phone buzzed, a text meant for Emily, forwarded to me because I'd mirrored her phone months earlier. Victor, come home. We need to talk now. I forwarded it straight to Carol. Evidence. 3 days later, at the safe apartment Carol arranged, 2 men in suits showed up asking Emily to sign something. Mason turned them away and kept the folder they'd left behind, a non-disclosure agreement. In exchange for Emily's silence, Victor would withdraw the assault complaint he'd already filed against me. Carol read it once and called it exactly what it was: witness tampering, a federal crime. That night, a forensic accountant named Marcus Webb walked us through what he'd found. Emily's name was listed as managing member on 3 LLCs, her signature obtained during a period of acute distress, or buried in stacks of routine paperwork she'd had no reason to read line by line. Money moved through those companies like a shell game, wire fraud, under federal jurisdiction. And because her name was on the documents, she was legally exposed as a potential co-conspirator. He hadn't just controlled her. He'd built a trap with her signature as the lock so that leaving him meant walking toward a federal charge. That was why she'd stayed. Detective Ray Morales, a man I'd trained 15 years earlier, came in the next morning. He pulled 2 old complaints against Victor that had gone nowhere, and confirmed that with the USB drive, the medical records, and the tampering attempt, there was more than enough to open a formal case. He also warned me, Victor's attorney, Harrison Doyle, didn't take cases he couldn't win. Whatever was in my past, Doyle would find it and use it. An emergency protective order was filed and served. That evening, Emily finally broke down in my arms, real crying, years of it finally let loose. "I keep thinking I should have left sooner," she said. I told her surviving wasn't wasted time. It was the hardest work there is. That night, Diane Kensington requested a private meeting. She arrived in Chanel with a leather envelope. $2 million in trust for Emily's silence, a clean settlement, Victor withdraws his complaint, everyone moves on. I asked her directly if she'd done this before. Her composure cracked just slightly, enough to confirm what I already suspected. Victor had a wife before Emily. They'd handled that too. I declined the money and sent her home. Within days, Carol found the first wife, Natalie Brooks, living quietly in Portland with a rescue dog and an $800,000 NDA that had kept her silent for 4 years out of fear. Carol explained what Natalie hadn't known: an NDA can't stop testimony in a criminal proceeding. Victor's lawyers had no power to touch her for speaking the truth to police. Natalie agreed to testify. Meanwhile, Emily sat down with Carol for nearly 2 hours and told her entire story out loud for the first time. I sat in the hallway outside, listening to the rhythm of her voice shift from halting to steady, and I cried where no one could see me. When she came out, she walked straight into my arms. "I said it all out loud," she said, "for the first time." I told her I'd heard every word. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit confirmed it was worse than we knew: 7 shell companies. Not 3. Over $4.3 million moved across 6 years. Agent Patricia Dunn made it clear: Emily was being treated as a victim of coercion, not a suspect. Full stop. They froze every account tied to Victor's company. Meanwhile, Doyle filed a 43-page countersuit against me for aggravated assault, arguing that my training made my actions premeditated, a weapon, not a father's instinct. He also tried to get the protective order vacated, claiming Emily had stayed voluntarily for years. "Standard pressure tactics," Carol said. "A man who believes he'll win doesn't fight this hard." Victor was afraid. His own accounting firm had already quietly resigned. The night before trial, I sat alone in a hotel room with Margaret's photograph, the 2 of them laughing on a beach the summer Emily turned 7. Weeks before she fell off her bike and got back up with bleeding knees and said, "I'm okay, Daddy," for the first time. I wrote her a letter about that driveway, about how everything Victor had done to make her smaller didn't change the truest thing about her. She had always gotten back up. I promised her I'd be there when she did it again. Courtroom 47 smelled like old wood and history. Carol laid out the evidence with surgical precision: the USB drive, the medical records, the tampering attempt, Natalie's testimony. Doyle stood and argued that I wasn't a frightened father. I was a trained weapon who deliberately targeted Victor's hand. Carol answered by entering my own training curriculum into evidence: 20 years of programs that opened, every single time, with a mandatory module on de-escalation and the legal obligation to minimize force. The judge read it aloud and asked Doyle directly whether he had any evidence disputing that I'd issued 3 verbal warnings before ever touching Victor. He didn't. Natalie took the stand and told her story without flinching. Doyle didn't even attempt to cross-examine her. The jury deliberated 4 hours and 11 minutes. I counted every one of them. When they returned, Emily's hand found mine under the table and gripped it hard enough to hurt. Guilty on domestic violence, guilty on extortion, guilty on conspiracy. Victor sat frozen, staring at a fixed point on the wall, and never once looked at Emily as the deputies led him out in handcuffs. Later, my phone buzzed with 3 words from Marcus. DOJ confirmed. Clean, Emily's legal exposure, the entire trap Victor had spent 3 years building around her, was gone. Officially, irrevocably. 6 months later, Emily called to tell me she'd found a studio space in Santa Monica, 4 blocks from the beach, with a small patio where she planned to plant a lemon tree. I drove down on a Saturday morning, and this time the coffee was hot, and the feeling in my chest wasn't dread. Mason showed up with breakfast sandwiches, still teasing me about the 5 a.m. training sessions he'd once resented and now credited with saving his life. Emily showed me her first sketches for a client's guest house. Clean lines, thoughtful light, unmistakably hers. I took the worn, refolded letter from my jacket and handed it to her. She read it slowly on the front step of her own studio, the one with her name on the glass door, and when she finished, she looked at me with eyes that were full but steady. "I'm okay, Daddy," she said, the same words, the same decision underneath them, older now and finally completely true. I put my arm around her shoulders, and we sat there in the July light, 4 blocks from an ocean that moved the way it always had, older than everything. Steady in a way nothing in the last year had been. I thought about Margaret, about the promise I'd made her in a hospital room 8 years ago, and about how long and costly and necessary it had turned out to be to keep it. No amount of money, no family name, no legal machinery built on fear outlasts the truth once someone finally decides to say it out loud. My daughter taught me that. She'd been teaching me since she was 7 years old, standing up in a driveway with gravel in her palms, refusing to stay down.